You are listening to the All Spy Spectacular episode of the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Welcome to the 45th episode of the Paperback Warrior Podcast. My name is Eric. I'm going to introduce my co-host Tom in just a second. The podcast is an outgrowth of our blog, which can be found at paperbackwarrior.com, where we post daily reviews of vintage fiction paperbacks in the action-adventure, crime, western, and espionage genres. New podcast episodes come to you every single Monday. Today, we're going to be discussing vintage spy paperbacks. Tom, what was your idea behind this?
Anyway, I had a bunch of mini topics that I wanted to discuss with you on the show, and I noticed that most of them had to do with spy novels and series titles in the espionage area. So I thought we would just blow through them all in one themed episode.
So what do you have in mind?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about Ian Fleming's James Bond novels. I also finally convinced you to read the first book in the Donald Hamilton's Matt Helm series, and I have an idea what you're going to say about that. It differs quite a bit from my opinion, so I thought it might be fun for us to debate that a little bit, fight on the show for the fans. There's an obscure series title I want to turn our listeners on to in my review. And what spy novel do you want to review?
I'm going to do the Boise Oaks series by John Gardner, and specifically reviewing the 1970 installment, Trader's Exit.
Okay, cool. Before we get into the thick of things, how did you first get into the spy genre of vintage paperbacks?
Well, I think it began with growing up as a child and my dad watching that Man from U.N.C.L.E. show. It was always in syndication on cable TV. And listen, my parents watched everything from Star Trek to Mod Squad to MASH. So I watched a lot of TV while playing with action figures on the floor. And I used to rent the old James Bond films on VHS. But you know what, Tom? I was always intimidated by the spy and espionage books. And I know this isn't a true spy novel, but I tried, Tom Clancy's Patriot Games novel when that movie came out. And man, I was so confused by CIA analyst Jack Ryan that I really avoided spy fiction until you lent me a few novels that were, 180 pages or less, and consisted of a little bit more elementary approach with action enveloping the more technical aspects of espionage. Do you think I'm off base by thinking the spy novels require a little more patience and devotion to really understand them?
Well, the big boys in the genre, your Trevanians, your Robert Ludlums, your Tom Clancy's, and who write national security books, I think they like to, one, their books are huge. Two, they like to revel in the complexities of espionage, which is obviously in the real world is very complex. But that's not to say that there's not easy to read 180 to 200 page novels that fall squarely into the vintage paperback tradition that happen to be about espionage. And so I think that's what we should focus on today. For me, my introduction into the genre was the Evan Tanner series by Lawrence Block, which I read in the 1980s when I was a teenager. The series ran for 7 books between 1966 and 1970, with a follow-up sequel called Tanner on Ice in 1998, which really sucks, so just pretend that doesn't exist. The gist is that Evan Tanner was in the Korean War, and a piece of shrapnel destroyed the sleep center of his brain. As a civilian who can't sleep, he devotes his time to learning foreign languages and joining organizations supporting lost causes around the world, including from basic political causes like different freedom fighters and different civil wars to organizations like the Flat Earth Society. He eventually falls in with a secret espionage agency who deploys him on missions around the world, and his language abilities and vast Rolodex of friends around the world come in super handy on the missions. It's a very lighthearted series. It's funny. It's exciting. It's definitely worth checking out. It's the Evan Tanner series. The first book's called The Thief Who Couldn't Sleep, and it sort of provides the origin story for Evan Tanner in the world of espionage, and it sets up all the rest of the books. Probably best to read this series in order. Anyway, I just want to recommend that to people, and it was really my introduction to the spy genre. Super easy reading, lots of fun. It's the Evan Tanner series by Lawrence Block. Now, let me throw this at you. Have you ever read any of Ian Fleming's James Bond books?
I haven't. I've watched the movies, as I alluded to earlier, but I avoid the novels.
I read the first 2 books in the series before I started writing for Paperback Warrior. My wife and her brothers are also big fans of both the books and the movies, and I saw the movies as they came out, and I liked them just fine, but it wasn't like a religion for me the way they are for some people.
How were those 2 books?
Quite different from the movies. Ian Fleming wrote 12 novels and 2 short story collections starring James Bond, and then other authors took over, including John Gardner, who you like a lot. Anyway, I really liked the first book, Casino Royale. It was from 1953. It was a slow burn of a novel, and you can tell that Fleming was still trying to develop James Bond as a character. Bond gets deployed to a casino resort on a spy mission. It was nowhere near as action-packed as the movie with Daniel Craig, but man, the last 25 pages of Casino Royale were awesome, particularly the last few pages with the climax for me being actually the final line in the novel. I remember reading it and actually yelling, "Holy cow, that was hard-boiled as hell." Casino Royale ends so well that you just can't wait to read the next one. So I did. I continued and read James Bond Book 2, Live and Let Die, from 1954. Eric, this book sucked. People are going to tell you how good it is, but they are either lying or mistaken. James Bond gets sent to pursue an American criminal known as, get this, Mr. Big. Can we pause for a second and reflect on the poverty of imagination deployed in naming your crime syndicate villain Mr. Big? His real name is Bonaparte, and he's a black guy who's like way into voodoo. Anyway, Mr. Big is smuggling gold coins from the British territories into the Caribbean, and he also has ties to Soviet intelligence, which is why the Brits send Bond to America on this mission. James Bond bounces from Harlem to St. Petersburg, Florida, to Jamaica. Dude, the story is dumb. The characters are dumb. It is filled with all this voodoo stuff that really muddies up the plot. The book was a hit, of course, and everybody loves it except me. But their minds are clouded by their love of the movies, and they over-romanticize this book as something worth reading. It is not worth reading. That said, I still want to read Book 3, Moonraker, in the series. It's from 1956, and I have a hunch it's better. I'm assuming that Ian Fleming just sort of got better. Anyway, that's my James Bond story. You want to duke it out over Death of a Citizen right now?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So why don't you set it up for the audience?
All right, so back in November of 2019, I think it was episode 18 of the podcast, Tom did a feature on the Matt Helm series of spy novels by Donald Hamilton. The series was about a U.S. government intelligence community assassin named Matt Helm who gets sent on different foreign and domestic missions. The series ran 27 books between 1960 and 1993, with the first book from 1960 called Death of a Citizen.
Now, I should add at this point that Death of a Citizen is one of my favorite books of all times. And the Matt Helm series, at least the first dozen books or so, is without question my favorite series of all time. I read the books before I started writing for Paperback Warrior, so I was excited for Eric to read and review this first book, Death of a Citizen. Now, you read it, you reviewed it, and you didn't like it. Am I characterizing this correctly?
Bingo.
Okay, so without spoiling anything, give us the basic plot synopsis and your review, and then I'll offer my rebuttal and explain to our listeners why you're full of beans.
Yeah, fair enough. The novel introduces Matt Helm as a suburban husband and father living this quiet life in Santa Fe, New Mexico in like 1958. Helm has gained a bit of notoriety as this popular author of Western novels, which really parallels Hamilton's own career. He wrote Western novels also. It's at a neighborhood dinner party when Matt Helm sees a fellow guest named Tina, creating the perfect moment for the author to add some backstory into this really complex character. Readers learn that Matt Helm was in the U.S. Army during World War II, and he was recruited into the government's counteragent program. Think of an assassin killing enemy assassins, spies killing spies. It's that sort of thing. Matt Helm and Tina were both knee-deep in dead enemies for a 5-year period in war-torn Europe. So as co-workers and lovers, the two went their separate ways after the war. Helm, he just disappears into everyday citizenship, and Tina, she just disappeared until now. So after a brief exchange with a young aspiring novelist named Barbara, Helm departs the party only to find Barbara dead in his writing studio the following morning. Seemingly set up as the murderer, Matt Helm is reintroduced to Tina, who explains that Helm's atomic scientist neighbor is the target of some sort of criminal conspiracy or communist nation. Tina and her new partner are in town to stop the would-be assassin. Barbara the Dead Girl. Caught up in the crime and the old trade of killing, Helm is just thrust back into his former life as ally and partner to Tina. So that's the basic plot synopsis.
Fair enough. So what's your take? What didn't you like about this?
All right. So despite the novel's immense success and obvious critical acclaim, I found Death of a Citizen to be really just an average spy thriller. It's 140 pages, and honestly, nothing substantial happens during the novel's first half. The narrative is presented as this road trip. You got this road trip as Matt Helm and Tina drive to Texas. They rekindle their loving feeling. And I want you to note, listeners, that Matt Helm is happily married to a woman named Beth, and he's the father of 3 small children. But he's on this road trip with Tina, doing the nasty away from his family. With all the mileage, the story never really gains momentum once readers and the hero arrive at the destination. And aside from a few deaths, and there are a few deaths, Matt Helm isn't involved in much gunplay. And here's the thing, I was a bit befuddled by the big reveal, which is, it's the enemy is within, and Helm's dismissal of the most relevant portion of his life in the book's closing pages, which really just boggled the mind. I would assume the series gains quality with quantity, and maybe Matt Helm becomes a little more menacing in an international setting. I don't know. The end result is that I thought this was an average beginning to what is widely considered an enjoyable series of spy adventures, and I'm anxious to read the series' next installment, which, looking this up, it's called The Wrecking Crew, just to see if the series improves. So Tom, you tell me why I'm nuts.
All right, you are. I think this is an interesting opportunity for us, though, to actually disagree about a book in true Siskel and Ebert fashion, because we don't really do bylines at Paperback Warrior. We pretty much speak with one voice in our articles and reviews, and we edit each other's work. And so we end up rarely, the production schedule's so heavy at Paperback Warrior, we very rarely end up reading the same book. So there's very little opportunity for us to actually agree on a particular review. First, let me be magnanimous and say that you're permitted to have your own opinions, okay, Eric, on a book. You like what you like. I can no more make you like Death of a Citizen than I can make you like the taste of butterscotch, if that's not your thing. That said, I think you missed the point of Death of a Citizen. I'll grant you that it is not a balls-out action spectacular like Don Pendleton's War Against the Mafia, let's say. There's plenty of that to enjoy later in the series. Instead, Hamilton is giving us the story of a man who is an amoral killer by his very nature, who can no longer wear the costume of a suburban family man. The circumstances of the novel force Helm's hand into deciding who he wants to be, a meek husband and father or a trained killer. And you guys can guess which way he swings. Matt Helm is the citizen in Death of a Citizen. I guess I would liken the debut novel to the movie Taken with Liam Neeson. Matt Helm is a suburban family man with a very particular set of skills acquired over a very long career. Death of a Citizen is a brilliant novel because it explores the nature of a violent man who's just done conforming with polite society's expectations for him. Helm is a great narrator who presents his acts of violence and his slide back into his old life in this offhand and cavalier fashion. For instance, the most shocking scene in the book actually happens off-page and is revealed to the reader in an offhand remark in a single sentence. Donald Hamilton was just a genius who knew when to throw his punches, but he also knew when the reader's imagination could actually do the job better than his tightly wound prose. Eric, I hope you actually keep your word and continue with the series, at least for the first dozen books or so. The other paperbacks, I'll say, are more traditional spy assassin books with more traditional plotting. Book 2 is called The Wrecking Crew, and I thought it was a masterpiece. It was great. Now, the third book in the Matt Helm series, The Removers, ties up loose ends from Death of a Citizen regarding Matt's family. I didn't think The Removers was an amazing book, but I suspect that Hamilton needed to resolve the unresolved family issues from that debut. Bottom line for Eric is just don't give up on Matt Helm, man. You're going to like this series. I promise you will grow to love Matt Helm.
All right. Well, I'm certainly not going to give up. I'm going to read more Matt Helm. The debut novel wasn't terrible by any means, but it failed to live up to the hype for me personally. And, I would state for the record that you also raved about a Donald Hamilton novel called Line of Fire, and it was published by Fawcett Gold Medal in 1955. And what you and I have talked about, off mic, is that it was the precursor to Matt Helm. And this, if you're not familiar with this, it's about a hitman who gets involved with an innocent woman after she witnesses him shooting his intended human target. And then the two go on the run together, and the novel takes just a ton of twists and turns as readers learn more about the protagonist and his motives. Unlike Death of a Citizen, it's an action novel, like filled with action from the first page. So anyway, that's neither here nor there, I guess. But I enjoyed that book a lot.
I agree. Line of Fire was great. I would actually say that Line of Fire was almost like a rough draft of the Matt Helm series, in which he was finding his voice, because it's really the same narrative voice that he used throughout the Matt Helm series was used in Line of Fire as well. I think Assassins Have Starry Eyes also is essentially the same voice, and you see that sometimes with authors who are kind of finding that voice. I think John D. McDonald did the same thing with several of his standalones, which ended up being the voice that became Travis McGee.
Yeah, it makes sense.
All right, so let's move on. I stumbled upon an interesting series. I'm going to hand you these books across the table here. Pause for a second. Sorry, there's 3 books I just threw at you. The 4th one's on its way. I stumbled upon this really interesting series I want to tell you about, and most people don't even know it exists. The series in the U.S. is called Counter Spy. Now, there's a good series called Counter Spy by Brian Cleave, but I'm not talking about that one. There's also a series called Commander Shaw Counter Spy by Philip McCutcheon, and I'm not talking about that one. I'm talking about a 4-book Counter Spy series released between 1962 and 1966 by author M.G. Braun. Now, the books are Apostles of Violence, Operation Atlantis, Operation Jealousy, and That Girl from Istanbul. The series is actually a French series, but don't tune out. These are something special, man. Beginning in 1955, there was a French author by the name of Maurice Gabriel Brault, B-R-A-U-L-T, who lived from 1912 to 1984. He began writing espionage novels under the pseudonym of M.G. Braun, starring a French Secret Service agent named Al Glenn. The series was wildly popular in France and went on for about 75 installments over the next 24 years. Between 1962 and 1966, 4 books from the series were translated into English and released by Berkeley in the Counter Spy series. Those are the ones I just showed to you. So while 1962's Apotres de la Violence is the 25th installment in the French Al Glenn novels, Apostles of Violence is the number 1 in the English language Counter Spy series. So the book opens, our hero, it's first-person narration, which I like. This narrator, Al Glenn, is in Caracas, Venezuela, visiting another French special agent named Theo, who is stationed there with sexy Latinas serving his every need. However, this is no vacation. Satellite equipment with a deadly laser weapon belonging to either the Americans or the Russians, the French aren't really certain whose it is, has crashed in the Venezuelan jungle. Al and Theo need to recover this space weapon before it falls into the wrong hands. Theo sent for Al because of his experience in jungle fighting and also because Al is the star of this book series. Theo explains to Al and the reader that it's very important for France to find out whether the satellite belongs to the Americans or the Russians. Meanwhile, French scientists are 15 years behind in the field of laser technology. If Al and Theo can bring back the laser, the French will be able to catch up within a few short months. The presumption is that the Americans, the Russians, and the Brits are all aware of this fallen satellite location, and the race is on to find this crashed satellite in the Venezuelan jungle. After reading a lot of American and British spy novels, it's interesting to read one in which the hero is actually looking after the self-interest of a completely other country. The French team of Al and Theo parachute into the jungle, find the satellite crash site, and begin their dangerous journey back to safety. There's gunfire in the distance, and that gives them no sense of comfort that it's going to be a simple trip. The Venezuelan Indians living in the woods are shooting arrows at everything that moves. As you might expect, the French team encounters a voluptuous Brazilian girl to be their guide through the jungle to the crash site. As they encounter the teams from other countries while they're in the woods, it's the Americans who actually behave like kind of aggressive jackasses. And obviously this might bother some American readers, but I found it really interesting and allowed for the idea that not every American always behaves in a righteous and honorable manner at all times. As the multinational group begins being murdered one by one, it's up to Al Glenn to get to the bottom of the situation, so he'll be alive to star in future books. American readers will be tempted to compare Counterspy to another long-running popular French series with limited English paperback reprints, the Malco books. We've talked about those on the show by Gérard de Villiers. The Malco books are more traditional cloak and dagger espionage adventures, but this Braun book, Apostles of Violence, is a more simple jungle combat story with a genuine mystery woven into the plot. The Counterspy books are narrated by Al Glenn, and that first-person combat-based mission actually reminded me of Peter McCurtain's Soldier of Fortune series. I'd also favorably compare the series to Edward Aaron's Assignment books starring Sam Durrell. It's 143 big font pages. It's not a heavy lift to read it, but it was really action-packed, very straightforward, a linear paperback, very little character development or emotional flab. The translation was really smooth that you never know it was originally written in French. The heroes are plenty heroic and the villains are all heels. The novel was really just a lot of fun to read. Best of all, it had this killer twist of an ending that no one is ever going to see coming. I like this book quite a bit, and I want to read and acquire the other English reprints in the series. Weird little fun fact, and again, I don't know that this matters. I'm the only one who found this interesting. The English translations of the Counterspy novels are credited to Ralph Hackett, but Ralph Hackett is a pseudonym for the real translator, whose name was Lowell Blair. In the middle of the 20th century, Blair was a busy guy, translating important works of French literature into English, including The Count of Monte Cristo and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I'm guessing that he regarded the Counterspy paperbacks as beneath his austere talents, so he performed the translation under a fake name. The actual rationale is just a secret. I want to thank the always excellent Spy Guys and Gals website for providing me the background on this series. So I think maybe you should do your review now.
Okay. Yeah, I'm reviewing Boise Oaks number 6, Trader's Exit by John Gardner. British author John Gardner enjoyed a literary career that flourished with a number of spy and espionage thrillers. He was chosen by Ian Fleming's estate to author 14 James Bond novels, successfully maintaining Fleming's approach and tone. While the James Bond empire kept Gardner gainfully employed throughout the 80s and 90s, his first foray into the spy genre was an 8-book series starring the lovable but intentionally incompetent British spy named Boise Oaks. The debut, The Liquidator, was published in 1964, but my first taste in the series is the 6th installment, Trader's Exit, which was originally published in 1970. And from what I can gather, Trader's Exit is unlike any other book in the series. In fact, Boise Oaks isn't even the main character. Instead, the story is told in the first person by a guy named Rex Upsdale. Now, Rex is this low-caliber author, and he's barely surviving off of royalties produced by his own spy series. His bills are like the Mount Everest of bad debt, and he's still holding out for anyone in Hollywood to actually adapt his series to film instead of signing worthless movie option contracts.
So this is a spy series by a spy author about a spy author.
Yes.
I like it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So, let's say that Rex really isn't turning away any knocks on the door. So thankfully, after authoring a controversial magazine article about an authentic British spy named Kit Styles, Rex receives 2 visitors. Now, Kit Styles was the golden boy of British spies. Unfortunately, he defected to Russia during the Cold War, spilling numerous state secrets and propelling Russians' momentum. The DI5, which essentially is England's version of the CIA, have offered Rex the deal of a lifetime. They offer to pay off all of the author's debt. They'll give him a check for $10,000 and the promise to never ask him for favors again. But what could possibly warrant this type of cash? Well, they want Rex to fly to Russia and interview Styles for a magazine article. Easy peasy, right? Gardner's clever writing is a satirical look at the spy genre, both from the stance as an author and reader. Rex describes his spy series as an exploitation on the spy boom, stating that anyone who could write got on the bandwagon. He even boasts that he wrote the second book in the series standing on his head. I think, in a way, Tom, this was Gardner's unique insight into the era's publishing industry. It was a kind of a wacky time in the 70s for spy
Clearly
spoofs. But once trouble arrives, which then introduces Boise Oaks into the plot, Rex often has a fantasy novel constantly running through his mind as a form of mental escape. It's a unique writing style by having the reader not only engaged in Trader's Exit, but also this swanky private eye story that's also running through Rex's own thoughts. and it's clearly an ode to Raymond Chandler. Gardner is also very conscious of his peers, with having two characters in the book name drop, get this, Modesty Blaze, Matt Helm, and Callan. So often Rex screams or asks for these fictional characters to assist him in the most dire situations.
To be clear, these characters are not in the book, right? It's just the character like calling upon them for inspiration.
Yeah, he'll scream like, he's like locked in a room or something. He's like, where's Matt Helm when I need him?
That's so funny.
Like that. So his presentation and his dark humor, I thought was reminiscent of Jimmy Sangster, an author that I like really well.
Yeah.
And Sangster penned two humorous spy novels, which I've talked about numerous times on the show. And he also wrote Touch Feather. And it's these type of books that Gardner views as tongue-in-cheek. But anyway, it was just a really fantastic, very funny novel with plenty of action-adventure to please the serious diehards. Trader's Exit will be the perfect entrance into John Gardner's stellar work. I think this one's a must, man.
And I'm assuming, do you think that his work with this series is kind of what won him the James Bond gig later in his career?
Yeah, no doubt. I'm sure. He seemed like he had so much diversity, and he was obviously a very capable writer, so I think that was his golden ticket.
Since we have a couple minutes left, I want to throw in an extra review here. It's for a book in a series. In fact, let me hand this stack to you here. I want you to take a look at these. It's a series, and I read the first one only so far, but I've been buying them up like crazy because I had such nice things to say. I knew there'd be a run in the market. It's the Super Secret Agent Phyllis series. This is book number 1 that I want to talk about. It's called The Fall Guy by Richie Perry. Between 1972 and 1985, Richie Perry, who was born in 1942, wrote a 13-book series starring a British intelligence agent named Phyllis, Phillis. It's a dude. He's battling international criminals who pose a national security threat to Great Britain. In the U.S., the paperbacks were published by Ballantine, but many of them have been released as ebooks. Actually, I think only 3, because I did a head count there, which should save you some time of hunting them down. Anyway, the first book in the series, the 1972 opening installment, The Fall Guy, is available as an ebook. The British intelligence arm in the series is called SR2, with the initial standing for Special Responsibilities. The group's designed to do things that the police are not able to do, namely assassinate threats without the blessing of a judge or a jury. In the series debut, Scotland Yard wants SR2's help in neutralizing the South American end of a cocaine trafficking operation, while the cops handle the domestic arm in the UK. After an SR2 sleeper agent in Brazil goes missing during the investigation of a drug exporter, a new operative is needed in the region, and that's where Phyllis comes in. So the Fall Guy is a origin story for Agent Phyllis, the hero of this 13-book series. When we meet him, he's a small-time British smuggler of booze and cigarettes working in a beach town in Brazil. After a lengthy prologue giving the readers a third-person view of the intel agency's mission and its challenges, the narrative then abruptly switches to first person with this charming and humorous British guy named Phyllis telling the story. He's this wisecracking playboy who ends up getting kidnapped by SR2 operatives who convince him to search for the missing SR2 agent in this Brazilian beach town. Nearly the entire paperback takes place in the Brazilian coastline, and the author, who's also written some nonfiction books about Brazil, makes the culture and topography of Brazil really come alive. I've never been there, but I felt like I have after I read the book. It ended up being a great setting for a thrilling adventure. As Phyllis gets closer to the truth about the missing spy, the author ends up ratcheting up the intensity and extreme violence, and so consider yourself warned if violence troubles you, but if it did, you probably wouldn't be listening to this podcast. Where does Super Secret Agent Phyllis fall among the spy fiction cohorts? It's not as dense as like a Robert Ludlum novel or a Tom Clancy book, but I think it's way smarter and better written than a Nick Carter Killmaster volume. The cheeky first-person narration reminded me a bit of Donald Hamilton's Matt Helm series, and its well-written kind of Britishness of the whole thing reminded me of Adam Hall's Quiller books. In any case, it's a way smarter book than the illustration on the Ballantine paperback covers would have you believe. In short, I haven't been this excited to start a new espionage series in a long, long time, and I'm hoping that the later installments keep up the same high level of quality as on display in The Fall Guy. Again, the author's Richie Perry. The series order is a bit of a mess. As often the case, the American publisher renumbered the series for the domestic reprints. However, with the exception of the first installment, I'm told that adhering to strict series order is really not required. Bottom line is it starts with The Fall Guy in 1972, goes for 13 books. The final one is Colwezi in 1985, but that one was British only. There's 3 of them later in the series that never had an American printing. 3 others are available on Kindle, but again, you should find most of them as Ballantine reprints from the 1970s and early 80s. The author also published a 1991 novel called Comeback that many sources online list as the 14th book in the Phyllis series, but my research shows that the book stars an entirely different lead character who may or may not even exist in the same universe, so I can't really help you there. Overall, fantastic. Very funny novel with plenty of action adventure to please serious diehards. So I think you're really going to like this.
There's a lot of spy stuff out there, and I think we should do another spy episode sometime soon.
Yeah, I'm thinking of different series I want to talk about. I want to talk about the Sam Durrell Assignment series by Edward Ahrens. I want to talk about the Secret Mission series by Don Smith, the Gregory Hiller series by Jack Laughlin, the John Gale series by Stephen Francis. What am I missing?
Well, there's the Earl Drake series by Dan J. Marlowe.
Yeah.
There's the Paul Chavez books that were written by Jack Higgins. As I mentioned earlier, Jimmy Sangster wrote a couple great spy novels starring John Smith that I reviewed last year. And gosh, you got to mention Nick Carter. It's a big one. We have multiple series installments reviewed at paperbackwarrior.com. And we even did a podcast feature on Nick Carter back on, looking at the list here, episode 25.
Yep. Anyway, so I suppose we can always leave them wanting more. And on that note, we're going to close out this episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. Please join us every day on the website for new reviews of old books. And we're going to see you next Monday for the next episode. And that'll be our last episode for the month of May 2020. So long, everybody.
Have a great week. Bye-bye.